Before we start today's episode on the metaphysics of Unknown Armies, a few notes. If you're hearing this before December 6, 2024, a bunch of us from the Mage the Podcast community, as well as Darker Days Radio, will be running games at PAX Unplugged in Philadelphia under the name The Detention Center as part of the Alexandria Game Library Open Play program. There'll be something like 7 sessions of Mage in total, which I personally think is pretty great. I'll also have the Mage the Podcast sticker packs that Rusted Icon made for us, and that'll be the first time they will be available until I figure out how to set up a little web store to sell them to the public. Also, thank you to everyone for your patience with our somewhat erratic release schedule over the last month or so. I've been dealing with some health issues, and I'm hopefully now on the mend, but it's going to be a few more months of treatment ahead of me before I'm kind of back up to full strength, so things may be slow for a bit. I'm shooting for bi-weekly episodes, and I'll have a few more coming out in the upcoming weeks to kind of fill out what I missed in November. Back to today's episode. Unknown Armies is a game that can go pretty hard and frequently talks about self-destruction and self-destructive practices that people can do to try and accrue magical power. We use dipsomancy frequently as an example of how the magic system in the game works, which is garnering power from alcohol. From about the 1 hour and 4 minute mark to the 1 hour and 8 minute mark, we discuss a canon character who is empowered by self-harm, and I just wanted to call that out. If you have a problem with either one of those, just wanted to clear that in advance. Otherwise, it was a lovely conversation with the folks behind 33.3 FM about a fascinating and interesting game. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. It's your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Joining me today is our senior Unknown Armies correspondent and senior conspiracy correspondent, Jordan Etherington, who you may know as Lopsubdoy on the Discord. Jordan, how you doing?
Good. I just did the peace sign and realized this is an audio format. So I'm doing great today.
And also joining us from the delightful podcast 33.3 FM are Frank and Tormsen. Frank and Tormsen are the hosts of a podcast about Unknown Armies. We have covered Unknown Armies on Mage the Podcast previously, I believe, twice. One was on other systems and how they portray violence and magic. Another was an interview with Greg Stolze, who has also written for World of Darkness games. But today, our goal is to spend some quality time getting to the metaphysics of Unknown Armies, what its magic system is like. Frank, Tormsen, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here. Happy to have a chance to talk about this game. Happy to have a chance to talk about really the wider sphere of occult-tinged weird magic RPGs in general. It's there's a lot of people, a lot of games in the sphere, and it's always nice to hear from some of the other fan bases out there.
And Tormsen?
Yeah, great to be here. I like what you just said about how we just lean into it with the real world weirdness. There's a bit by Kenneth Haidt where he talks about like the real world being the best setting, and that's also applicable to this. Like, I understand there are good reasons why you want an analog sometimes, but you'll just get more material by just using the Scientologists. Just use it as it is and add magic. It works.
Yeah. Why use an XP for like this historical figure that you enjoy or this public figure that you find funny? Or you can just use that guy. Just use that guy.
Yeah, the Comte de Saint Germain is sitting right there.
Yeah.
As Ken Haidt says, start with Earth.
What is 33.3 FM?
33.3 FM is our Unknown Armies podcast, the only dedicated Unknown Armies podcast that we're aware of. It is, the conceit of it is we're a couple of shock jock radio occultists hiding in a bunker somewhere, occasionally in different universes, occasionally on holiday. And we talk about Unknown Armies while also talking about things that don't have anything to do with Unknown Armies. And we bring it back in somehow towards the end of the episode.
Yeah, that covers a lot of it. 33.3 FM is nominally a Unknown Armies podcast. We take a lot from sort of the grand folk history of conspiracy radio, as Unknown Armies as a game tends to draw from those sorts of spheres and themes often. And a lot of it is just, Tormsen and I have interest in things related to occultism, fringe subcultures, a bit of true crime in there. And Unknown Armies is historically a game that tends to bring in a lot of that stuff. So we're fans of the game, and we're interested in discussing those other things. So fundamentally, Unknown Armies gives us a good framing device to center all that around. Something enthusiastic for us to talk about in terms of like creative application for those things we're into. And then also just a good excuse to be like, hey, Let's talk about, symbology of cuckoldry for an hour and a half.
When you say the conspiracy radio, are we talking like Coast to Coast AM, Alex Jones, Ground Zero, Fade to Black stuff? Okay.
Exactly.
Much kinder. Well, like, I don't want people to hear, oh, they're like Alex Jones, and then stop listening right there.
Inspired by, not
yes,
like.
it is fundamentally a bit.
The vibe. Yeah, the vibe.
Yes,
of
exactly.
It's conspiracy when it's fun and not when you dig too deep and too greedily.
Yeah, we do deal with those topics sometimes because we also find those interesting, but we always try to do it in, as informed and respectful a manner as possible, ideally while bringing on someone that can speak to those topics from more of a like, hey, when people talk about the hidden puppet masters behind the world that they need to unveil, that's my family that they're obliquely referring to.
An interesting thing about how Mage and Unknown Armies both approach conspiracies are like they both do it, but it feels different. And you guys like really make that like vibe come across. I think Mage feels a little more academic, whereas 33.3 and Unknown Armies feels a little more shocky, but not in an intellectual judgment way, just like the feel of dialogue.
It's a bit sort of grittier, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Lowbrow.
Yeah, dirtbag left, kind of Thomas Pynchon-y lowbrow.
It also seemed to be the case that some of the natures of the conspiracies that you discuss tend to be, no. There really is a supernatural mover and shaker. One of the emerging things of Mage over time has been kind of like, the more you look into it, the more at the end of the day, it really is just mortals living their lives. And if mages are lucky at the periphery, we can kind of steer the elephant a little bit. So it's interesting to hear about a game or a worldview where it's like, no, it's the Illuminati all the way down. And I'm like, well, this is different.
Yeah, but the
also
Illuminati
the Illuminati is weird.
Yeah, the Illuminati isn't necessarily what you think it is. It's actually, to draw a faction from the game, a conspiracy of evangelical plutocrats that enslave the ghosts of the victims of America's imperial wars.
So, kind of to get into Unknown Armies, for people who are unfamiliar, kind of what is the contrivance of the game, and what would you say the metaphysics are, in the sense of where does magic or magic stuff or weird stuff just kind of come from?
The best sort of pitch I have for role-playing literate audience is Unknown Armies is an urban fantasy game started by John Tynes, the guy who came up with Delta Green, and Greg Stolze, who's worked on Delta Green and World of Darkness and a lot of other games during the 90s and since. That sort of mixes neo-noir, urban legend, conspiracy, horror, and crime elements into a heady brew. As far as media touchstones, I'd say comparisons can be drawn to the works of David Lynch, the Coen brothers, Robert Anton Wilson, and Chuck Palahniuk. If you want me to get even more succinct than that, imagine if David Lynch directed Fight Club. It's kind of like that.
From there, Tormsen, what kind of drives the cosmos? So we get the idea that very quickly you thumb through, there's supernatural weirdness going on. In some games, the supernatural weirdness is because God has touched the world. There's a hidden world. In other cases, we're in a dimension that contains elves. Where does the weirdness in Unknown Armies that we would identify as supernatural, where does that come from?
There's two larger sources of weirdness, and that's the big divide between your what are called avatars and adepts. And I'm going to cover on it sort of quite briefly. So avatars derive their power from archetypes, so your Jungian archetype. And I was thinking a bit about this, and it's been referenced before that Unknown Armies has a metaphysics which is a bit like America in that it's a representative democracy. When human beings become the archetypes. So the quote unquote gods of the setting are the archetypes, but they were people at some point that ended up becoming the collective unconsciousness decided that this person was the perfect representative of a human concept. And I mean, they can stay up there in the invisible clergy, but if they lose relevance, they fall down. There's a bit of a back and forth in terms of, I feel in other games, the collective unconsciousness has a different kind of power that's more like a direct democracy. Well, it's going through the archetypes because the archetypes can also have effect on the zeitgeist. But that's getting into the weeds a bit. But the point is, avatars derive their powers from these Jungian archetypes. So you're the mother, the warrior, and then more modern ones like the MVP. things like that. And you'll get the universe will, the way you're getting a magical powers is by performing a role that is already ingrained into the universe to such an extent and playing it so well that the universe will just help you to do certain things because that's what a mother would do. That's what a warrior would do. And the universe sort of just greases the wheels a little bit for you. Whereas your adepts are people who have gone the other way and they've decided that they know how the world works. They have their worldview, which is extremely idiosyncratic, and they become obsessed with maybe it's drinking, maybe it's stealing, maybe it's pretending to be a famous figure. It's a very idiosyncratic worldview that their mind is cracked in a certain way, which gives them access to magical powers. And they learn from each other, but they also hate each other because all have slightly different worldviews. Even if they follow the same school of magic, they're like, no, you're doing it wrong. Only I do it right. So on one side, you've got a kind of magic which is based on very broad cultural archetypes, and another form of magic which is like what's known as postmodern magic, is more like adept magic, which is based on very idiosyncratic, very specific interpretations of the universe and exerting your power over it that way.
So a question. So if, say, like someone has sensed the invisible clergy, can they affect the collective unconscious, or do they lose their identity? Like, do they still have agency when they're up there?
That's not clear. That's a good
Yes.
question.
Yes. Well, how much does your average representative have agency over what they can do, right? It's like, yeah, sure, they can kind of choose what bills to sign and not sign, what motions to forward and not. But also, if they are acting counter to the wants and needs of the constituency for too long, then they tend to not stay in that role for very long either. Unknown Armies is the collective unconscious as Republican democracy, as opposed to direct democracy.
Okay, so in Mage the Ascension, we have the idea that reality is a bit more of a direct democracy, that literally the more people that you can get believe in something, the better. Here, there are a finite number of slots. Mortals can kind of compete to be them. Say Jordan and I both want to be the archetype of the academic. So we publish, we do research and so on, but as we do that, we may gain more power towards that archetype, but what we do narrows. Our power would reduce if we were to have a family or to start traveling or to take up photography or something like
Take
that.
sabbatical, don't publish. Whichever one of us ascends would then inform how that archetype is defined in a way, like within the broad archetype of it, but like Terry as the incarnation of academic would differ from me as the incarnation of academic.
Yeah, maybe one is more data informed, one is more continental, one is more backstabby, one is more collaborative. And there's that feedback mechanism. Why does one want to ascend to use the term invisible clergy, which I assume are those who've kind of ascended to these archetypes? What is the benefit of doing so? How many are there? Is there a invisible college where the invisible clergy get together? Kind of, why do people shoot for that?
I mean, yeah, but God's pretty rad. And this is basically the closest thing that
apotheosis
exists in the
is its
setting.
own reward.
Okay,
Yeah.
so at its apex, you do ascend to something.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And the thing, okay, so one of the benefits of this is you essentially ascend to godhood. What kind of godhood is this? How do you get to direct the cosmos? Kind of what is your eternal reward, as it were, for this?
The way I've heard it put is that you become something both more and less than human because you are rendered into being a concept. It's the gods exist and they're all flanderized versions of mankind, which, is kind of subject to a lot of the issues you might expect with that. The game never goes into a huge amount of detail of the exact kind of what's greasing the wheels up there, what rules they operate on. You get a general sense that they have basically pretty close to absolute, may not absolute, but very strong dominion over anything within their sphere. The archetype of the demagogue would have a lot of control over politics, especially ones related to demagoguery. There's also a sense that there's a lot of bickering within the invisible clergy, within the collection of archetypes, because, fundamentally, when you hit 333 members of the invisible clergy, the universe ends, and the current clergy gets to make the next one. And you want to be still in the clergy when that happens. So, as a result of that, you're jockeying for influence with other archetypes, and there's a sense that, there's collusion and bickering and backstabbing to try to get the people allied with you staying in the statusphere. That's a whole staying in the invisible clergy, and the people that have a different idea of what they want the world to be, and especially what they want the next world to be, to get them ejected from it.
To get into the whole idea of the reward of it, like even if you do become the archetype, and even if you do become one of the 333 archetypes which make up the new universe, I mean, basically transformed into the metaphysical building blocks of another universe. It's heavily implied that you don't survive it as a conscious entity at all. You just define what the next universe will be by
with
being
a couple
there.
of
So it's not
with one like prominent exception, but that's getting in the weeds a little bit.
We're all about prominent exceptions here. So you made mention of the statusphere. I assume this is the realm to which the clergy ascend, or is this another thing entirely within the cosmology of the game?
I'd say that, it's where the clergy sort of operate. It's the, it's backstage Disney.
Yeah, because the invisible clergy sort of refers to the archetypes themselves, while the statusphere is the realm in which they operate. So backstage Disney is a good example, a good way to describe it. They're not the only things up there. No. It's implied, but they're the main things up there.
To me, I love the idea that this is a war that avatars within Mage, the portion of mages that allow them to do magic. This is what is pushing them towards ascension, that each of them wants to be represented within this cosmological space, this cosmological entity that allows for the creation of new realities. This factionalism amongst it, this thing pushing us towards getting your arete to 10 or whatever, is because your avatar wants say in that next reality. And I like the idea that it hit the 333 and suddenly we got Mage the Awakening or something like that, or whatever game that you want to play.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I really enjoy that. I really enjoy how the war for it is simultaneously like individually much more like the stakes are higher, but it also feels like much harder to really connect to it because like you're not going to the statusphere. You're not going to visit the invisible clergy, is my understanding. Like it,
you might a little bit. You might get a glimpse up there,
but yet like you can end up being like if you get like a high enough avatar rating, like the current like I don't know, masterless man might really try to kill you. For example, and that's really interesting because you don't really get that in Mage very often. You're not going to have a Methuselah vampire generally trying to kill you.
That's it, because if you're a high-powered avatar of an archetype, you have two potential threats. One is if the archetype that's up there, the sitting archetype in the clergy, doesn't like you or what you represent, that could be a problem. And the other thing is if his current representative on Earth, known as the Godwalker, who is the most powerful earthly avatar of an archetype, if they don't like you, there's only one seat in the clergy, and there's only one Godwalker
for each archetype.
at once for each archetype.
Is the Godwalker then adversarial?
Yes.
Yes,
it's a very it's a rule, kind of, to go to another nerd thing. It's sort of a rule of two situation, right?
Okay, yeah. There's always a master and an apprentice.
Star Wars.
There's always a master. There's always the apprentice. Yada. And largely the seated archetype doesn't really care about all the low-level avatars running around competing with each other for the Godwalker. It's only usually once someone gets to Godwalker pretty close that they're like, oh, I need to keep an eye on this guy. They're still kind of giving you their power as an avatar. You're still getting it from the archetype. But by the time you reach Godwalker, you're sort of it's implied, I'd say, to be a sort of transitionary state where, because at that point, there's a suite of powers, of 4 powers associated with each kind of avatar. And as you become more powerful, you get access to more of them. Once you're a Godwalker, you get your own special Godwalker power that nobody's ever had before or nobody will ever get again.
It feels kind of like a succeed or die state where, say, if, for example, like we go back to the academic thing, if I'm at like 90% academic, I can't really just drop this and be like, well, I'm just going to go take up gardening. It's either like I have made my decision, like either, I don't know, I die of old age somehow, or I ascend. Like my entire life is defined by this avatar state now.
The Pope can't really step back from being Catholic. Would that be a
Yeah,
reasonable analogy? Okay.
I think that you can.
I think it would be like
Yeah,
psychologically.
it'll be hard. Very difficult.
Well, you can, something to point out that's important. You can be an avatar accidentally. You can
Yeah.
be doing all this stuff where you are fulfilling this cosmological role and not even realize you're doing it. So, but like once you get into like the really higher echelons where things get really competitive with other avatars, then it's more dangerous to sort of step back because they're generally all kind of gunning for each other. But at lower levels, you can, it's a big
Yeah,
thing to
yeah.
be like, I've dedicated a huge portion of my life to acting in a role like an archetypical cowboy, and I'm just going to give all that up.
Yeah.
A lot of people aren't going to do that, but you can.
I do like the idea of, as a character concept, like a formerly very high-powered avatar
Yeah.
that like retired to his farm, like Cincinnatus, and is just not involved until they bring him back in. Like that works as a concept, but it would be the exception. Once you're up to that level, yeah, you've got skin in the game. You've devoted a lot of your time and a lot of your life to it. Yeah, stepping away would be a big decision, but if
Yeah.
you did it, you did it.
What I'm imagining there is the scenario of it's like you're an ex archetype of the super spy. So when they roll up with all of the black helicopters and the black SUVs and whatnot, you're just like, really, guys? You're doing this bit? You're going about it like this?
I do really like the fact that you have competition from beside and above. So obviously the mother doesn't want the predator to advance in power and possibly ascend to the invisible clergy. But
It's other mothers that they're worried about too.
Well, seemingly it is both, because at the end of the day, they do have a purview, and I assume that purview has opinions about how they wish the world to function. And on the Mage side, this immediately, we get the idea of the oracles and exemplars, that these are the apex forms of understanding of a sphere, of a particular type of knowledge. And they all operate chantries because they want to further the agenda of forces. They want the understanding of electrodynamism and weather and quantum electrodynamics to be advanced. So they want to cultivate a coterie of people who have the ability to understand that and influence it. But at the same time, the easiest way to become that oracle is to somehow take out another oracle. You don't want to wait 7 centuries until that master kind of ascends. I also like the fact that it seems to be the case that you never quite know what your opponent is capable of. So if as you gain in advancement, you're gaining these special powers as a Godwalker, kind of these aspects of these agents of the archetype or those closest to the archetype, there's something special about you. You may have the idea that the archetype of the assassin has something pertaining to that, but kind of at the highest level that you have this one little trick that is unique to you, I think is really neat. So I like the idea in Mage that the moment you become an Archmaster, you got your spheres, but you got this one weird other thing that keeps everyone on their toes because they don't know what it is. This feels like, would you say the action in this game is very cloak and dagger?
It can be.
Okay.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
My understanding that although there are only 333 spots, there are significantly more than 333 archetypes. So you can end up in a situation. So like that increases the stakes too.
It's never been quite clear how many archetypes like have actually ascended, how many there are. Like to be an archetype, you have to have ascended, and they have to be these sort of broad, culturally applicable ideas that in most cultures you could point to as like a mother that's across most cultures, and in the modern era, more archetypes are going up. Like, for example, if something's super specific to a single culture or super like just a stereotype or a trope, not necessarily going to ascend as an archetype because it doesn't have that sort of broad-based human appeal on the global collective unconsciousness. It's not ever stated how in the game how many archetypes have actually ascended. It could be somewhere in the 200s, which means we've got plenty of time, or it could be 331, and we're in trouble soon. The universe is going to reset soon. This means that there's only like a few dozen, well, not maybe a bit more than a few dozen official ones, nowhere near 333, and plenty of unofficial ones. But yeah, it's not stated how many archetypes there are, but it is limited in a way that adepts aren't, because adepts are more idiosyncratic. Whereas with your archetypes, you have to at least sell them as like, this is something which most people can relate to as a concept.
Say you started from like the beginning of the universe. There are like obviously 0 avatars right now, but the number of potential like Jungian avatars is more than 333. So when you
Sure.
make the next
Yeah.
universe, there might be an archetype that just was not present for the creation of the previous one.
Oh, and that can happen
yeah.
mid-universe too. There's turnover as archetypes become more or less relevant culturally. The archetype of the dandy, not necessarily as relevant in modern culture. That it's very possible that got replaced at some point by someone that's like the archetype of, say, the fuckboy.
Yeah. So for example, like if you're like an avatar of say the socialist or like or just whatever, you really don't want the fascist to be in the invisible clergy like at all for the next universe because you don't want that to have any say in the creation of the next universe, let's say.
Not unless you got some Red Brand Alliance thing going on, no.
I was thinking of this before when you were bringing up the mother versus the predator, because that's an example of, there's a ideological clash or a conceptual clash there, and yet some of it's going to be down to the what's the next universe all about, but also who's in my sphere. So it could like the mother versus the predator. It's an obvious example where you'd be on the mother's side morally, but if it's the mother versus like, what's the word for it, like child
If the mother's a
protection
turd.
advocates. If the mother's a turf, that's an issue.
Yeah,
We've talked about this. But if it's like some other figure that is like about protecting children or protecting the weak, that seems to be like muscling in on mother's turf, they'd also be against that, even though they're not. It's not necessarily because it's not the morality of it. It's about are you in my territory or not?
Yeah.
So
like conceptual turf.
Niche protection.
Yeah.
As
Yes.
the academic,
Exactly.
I completely understand that.
Yeah. Is there anything that broadcasts one's archetype? Because the impression I get from this is you find this person that radiates matronly power, and this could be the matron, the crone, the mother, the tiger mom, the paralyzing sense of obligation to one's parents. Yeah.
So something I want to clarify is the mom, the tiger mom, same archetype, really. It's very easy for a rather I wouldn't say easy, but like it's entirely possible for a person that represents a particularly negative version of a generally positive archetype to ascend to the clergy, and that therefore influence world culture is a way like a particularly abusive individual could easily ascend as the mother. And then that just kind of ends up characterizing the whole family relationship of motherhood for the entirety of the world until someone else ascends in their place.
And likewise, suddenly the predator is actually the vigilante, is the person who removes the unjust that society does not itself have the tools. It acts as a jus gladii or something like that. Okay. And are these things known when you meet that avatar? Is it obvious what they are an avatar of, or is it just one of those things through implication manner, what we would call in Mage resonance, that just kind of implies what this person is, or is there like the blinking sign?
It's not obvious to the average person, obviously. Not obvious to what you call in Mage the sleepers, which is a different term in Unknown Armies that we'll get into. Every avatar in the core books and every fan one all have the symbols, known associated symbols of an archetype, and these are things like these are the trappings of it, and it's not about showing off. What is about showing off to the universe that you're the mother, that you're the MVP, that you're whatever. Yeah. If you'd want to identify one, you need to have some experience in like you'd have a supernatural identity, which is another thing which allows you to see avatars. I had characters who've had that before. It's not necessarily going to be obvious because a lot of people actually, avatars, unlike adepts, avatars, especially like low to middling ones, many of them are unaware. They don't know that they've got magical powers because they just think, oh, things are going great for me. They don't know that the universe is tweaking things for them a little bit. So no, it's not quite as obvious unless you're specifically looking for it.
The other side of that is just because most people, there's no like metaphysical magical alarm bells that start going off when they they run into an avatar. They're still going to get those sorts of vibes from the person, right? Like, if you run into a mother avatar, you're gonna be like, oh, this person seems really matronly. Or when you run into a avatar of the predator, you're gonna be like, I don't trust this guy.
It reminds me of that meme of like Spot the anime protagonist, if you've ever seen that, where it's
like the hair and stuff.
or like,
Yeah.
it's like, where's the stand user? And then it's just like one person with like, who looks like they're in a fashion magazine.
Yeah.
But speaking of weird people who look like they're out of a fashion magazine, possibly, perhaps we should talk about adepts as well, because they're sort of the other side of the coin of the avatars. So tell us, what is an adept? And more importantly, kind of what do they think they are?
They think they got it all figured out.
Yeah, they sure do.
Exactly. They've got an adept has had their mind cracked in a very specific way. They figured out how the world works, and actually, it's all about getting drunk, or it's all about making very specific weird drugs, or it's all about what's another adept that's not just like a bad habit, Frank?
Oh, a lot of them are bad habits. Let's be honest.
I always liked the one that was about like how clothing separates
Sure.
humanity from animals.
How about one that's like taking pictures, right? Or buying books, right? Those aren't necessarily bad habits, though. They very easily can be. And the way adepts do them, they often end up becoming that. But yeah, taking pictures of something, not necessarily bad. Getting a new book, not necessarily bad.
There's an example given, I think, in second ed about how if you see the invisible clergy and your archetypes and avatars as like the cool kids getting into the nightclub, your adepts are the ones who just walk away, say, we're gonna start our own nightclub with klezmer music. And I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Yes, very much so.
And then try to teach others and then make more adepts. But then again, it's rule of two, because whoever your disciple is decides, no, you're slightly wrong. My way is the way.
Yeah, adepts their magic is very much fueled by obsession, and that ends up creating an extreme narcissism of small differences effect. But it's also fueled by paradox and cognitive dissonance.
Yes, the laws of magic. Could you tell us about those?
Okay, so with the laws of magic, the paradox thing, and I know that has a different meaning in Mage, but with paradox, it's all about every magical school is built on an essential cognitive dissonance that has been accepted by the adept, and it is the driving force of that school. The example of dipsomancy, which is drinking magic, is that drinking makes you feel better when you're becoming objectively worse. And every magic school sort of has to have that sort of core, the paradoxical core that drives it. And that's one of the three laws of magic. You want to hit the other ones?
The symbolic tension is that first one that you just went over. The second is transaction, which is basically the principle you ain't getting something for nothing. There's no free lunch.
Yeah.
You generally need to do some sort of ritualistic act to get something called charges, and there's different kinds of charges, different levels, but basically any spell you're casting has a charge cost. So if you want to be casting this magic, if you want to be doing these spells, you need to be living your life in a certain way. And that requires doing these acts that get you power, and it also requires obedience and living within the confines of the adept school's taboo.
Yeah, mechanically that is derived as like the way you charge, which is to get powers. Like you have the acts that you have to perform in order to get your magical powers, and they can vary, but often with the schools there's specific ones.
It's like domain based. Like there's an adept for cigarettes, where you get charges by unsurprisingly smoking, is an example.
And what's the taboo?
That's what you can't do if you want to keep your charges, because you live in a very specific way. To go back to the drinking magic, for dipsomancy, you lose all your charges if you ever sober up. There's another one, oneromancy, which is about which is like a dreaming based magic where you lose your charges if you go to sleep. So there's different things, and that's, you don't want to lose your charges. The more expensive a taboo is, like the more costly and onerous it is to maintain, not always the more, doesn't mean necessarily that you can do more impressive magic, but things are a bit cheaper in terms of like that. The harder it is, the more the sort of cost benefit ratio skews in your favor.
So it seems like the descriptor so far is these taboos prevent you from building up too much. So I assume the dipsomancer, just out of necessity of human biology, at some point has to be sober. Mm-hmm. Either they fall asleep or do something like that. Likewise, the Oniromancer can only be awake for so long. But kind of that the goal of an adept is to, when an adept wants to get all magic-y, that they start engaging with these transactions to build up charges. They avoid their taboo, and that there is this kind of increasing tension as they store up charge, but eventually may run into their taboo. They do their magic, and then they have the ability to kind of reset to a baseline where they either of necessity have to recover. Is that kind of the basic cycle of adept magic, or are there adepts that never engage in their taboo?
Yeah, keep going, ante up. Why do I need to be sober? Do I really need to be sober? Do I?
Still drunk when you wake up.
Yeah,
it's fine. Well, for example, Vestimancers, I believe the taboo is to not be naked. Is that right, Frank? If I'm remembering correctly?
That, I think that's right.
The taboo has to be something that is just, it makes your life a bit difficult. Yeah, you can definitely, there are would-be adepts who just manage to consistently avoid that taboo. For a taboo to be like a workable taboo for magic, it has to be something which differentiates yourself from the rest of humanity. It's a normal human thing that you have to avoid at all costs if you want to maintain your power. And so that creates that division between you and the rest of humanity, the collective unconsciousness, because you're behaving in a way which is slightly inhuman, I'd say.
Or at least incredibly self-destructive, often, like with dipsomancy.
I like that idea. You're refraining from something that makes most people human, and that allows a metaphysical separation from the collective unconscious that allows you to store magic potential that lets you do stuff. Is that a reasonable way of putting it?
I'd say so.
Yep.
They sound a lot like marauders.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What are marauders in Mage?
Within Mage, we have the phenomenon of quiet, which is when you magic too much, when you magic too hard, either you have paradox that can express itself externally or internally. A paradox flaw changes the world around you. Suddenly, everything you touch turns to ash. Your footprints leave wet marks behind you. You now have two left hands. And then you have quiet, where the mage's inner reality changes. They're no longer able to recognize the face of family members. It sounds like everyone is speaking with a Spanish accent. You can no longer literally see people who disagree with you. You always see on people's foreheads a mark indicating how they are going to die. Not necessarily true. At the far end of that is the marauder, who has so thoroughly wrapped themselves in quiet that their magic constantly makes their inner hallucination and the outer world match. In their head, it is still 1276, and as they move through the world, their magic makes everything around them look like it's 1276. This fall to quiet makes it so that paradox more or less no longer affects them. At worst, it merely makes them crazier.
So it's kind of like Adepts, but reversed in cause and effect.
Yeah. I was thinking like adepts are the people who look at reality and just go, mm-mm.
Yeah, that's fair. That's
well, it's not even a conscious denial of reality necessarily.
Yeah, like they really believe it. Like they really. That's an important thing I want to say is like adepts aren't like avatars can be cynical and like kind of how can I say cynical, like instrumental about it. Adepts really believe it, or else the magic won't.
Oh yeah, that's the thing, because adepts have to, because every character in the game has an obsession. And whatever it is, every person, like whether it's collecting Pokemon cards or whatever it is, it's something that you're obsessed with, or being the best, physical perfection, whatever. And if you're an adept, your obsession has to match and has to be tied to your adept skill, your adept school. Whereas avatars, that's not the case, because avatars about playing the role. It doesn't matter about your internal life. Like, it doesn't matter if you don't have to like your kids. You just have to act like a good mother to be the mother.
You don't even have to act like a good
Well,
mother. You just have to act like a mother.
act like that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Whereas if you're an adept, it's what you believe. It's your worldview.
It sounds like the avatars are orthopraxic and the
Mhm.
adepts are orthodoxic. And likewise in Mage, the magic doesn't work if you don't think it does. A mage can be cynical, but they cannot be cynical about how their own magic is done. So I like that as a line through the two. I also like the idea, a thing to steal from Mage, is the idea that one of the lovely things and terrible things about Mage is you can just kind of build up successes and do these extended rituals. I'd love to steal this notion from the Adepts that basically says, yeah, the first 3 successes you can just roll using your avatar. You want to get to that 4th success, there's this thing you have to do that fits with your paradigm that is some form of sacrifice. That is where the Akashic has to enter that 2nd day of continuous meditation. And to get to 6 successes, they have to do the 3 and now risk death from thirst to do it. So I like the idea that yeah, you can use your avatar, you can do magic, but to reach these certain rarefied levels, you do have to achieve that same separation from humanity in terms of the things people do on a normal everyday basis if you want to go above parlor tricks or things that can inconvenience or just nudge the world around you.
That's in Adepts, that's sort of illustrated in the divide between minor, significant, and major charges. So that's the sort of level of power that you get based on like what you do, the sacrifice you make. So yeah, parlor tricks, minor spells, those are your minor charges. Significant charges for more impressive stuff, and the major charge is the adept equivalent of becoming like the avatars want to ascend and they want to become the God Walker, whereas adepts, they want to get that major charge, which is doing the extreme act, which gets you that pulse of magical energy that lets you do like a wish spell in D&D, but specific to your domain.
Yeah, it's a magic blank check as long as it's within the sphere of your school's conceptual basis.
It's easy to think of Unknown Armies like lower power than Mage, but like a major charge seems to be like it leaps it above like what a mage is capable of. Like you can do anything basically within the theme.
So yeah, just to clarify on that theme, are the schools is what you have to do and what you can do tied? Like for instance, we have our dipsomancer, we have our alcoholic, and say as my supreme act, I hold a community kegger beer fest and I get 10,000 people drunk. And let's say that triggers my major charge or something like that. I don't know if that's appropriate. Does what I do with that now have to be drink related, or kind of how do those two, what you do and what you can do, how do those become tied?
So how you get particular kinds of charges are prescribed to the school. And, there might be multiple ways depending, but like for example, with dipsomancy, you need to take a drink. From what I remember, take a drink from a very specific, very historically significant vessel of alcohol. Like, for example, if it was wine, that was considered the blood of Christ. There you go.
Like literally,
the
Holy Grail.
Yes, like that sort of thing.
The original vintage.
Yes, the original vintage. The first beer that was ever brewed, stuff like that. So, like, all these are prescribed. It's not loose where it's like, oh, yeah, we think that's a strong enough act that it would get you a charge. Go for it. And it does need to be alcohol related, but it's not because of the method of charging so much as it's because your school is alcohol related. So you could be like, I want to be the dipsomancer that nobody can ever get drunk ever again. I remove alcohol from existence. You can do that with a major charge. Like all beer from here on out is non-alcoholic.
Or you can make it so like getting drunk does something different to you.
Also, totally viable. Yeah.
That works. Once you're at that, like with your minor and significant charges, because there's difference in the use of magic between formula spells and random magic. And formula spells are what is taught from like one adept, like a master adept and a disciple adept, and these are sort of written down specific effects. But there's also random magic, which is what you do when you don't know, no formula spell exactly fits, but you want to do some magic stuff. And then it sort of has to hit, it needs to fit into your purview, your penumbra. The further away it is from it, the more expensive it's going to be, and the more the gym is going to be like, no, you can't do that. That doesn't work. But when you hit major charges, and again, it should still be, once you're at that level, it will be stuck with your area of expertise, your domain. But once you're at that level, that's so much magic. That's so much magic. You could come up with a justification. You could do it probably.
Yeah. That's the
Brute
sort of thing
force
that an
at that
entire
point.
campaign has been leading up to. It's like, all right, we did it. We got our adept a major charge. How are we going to change the world?
So we've talked a lot about these different schools. I'd like to ask, what are your favorites?
You want to start this, Torm? You want to take turns? I got 3 in mind.
You go ahead.
All right.
Yeah, and just if you can give us an example of a minor and a major power. The major powers sound absolutely fascinating. It is a weird case because in Mage, it is something that is world changing, but not necessarily, how to put it, it is not necessarily interesting for your character. Like becoming the level 20 paladin with a demon slayer +5, you're like, oh my god, look at how potent I am. That's really actually nothing in comparison to destroying the liquor industry, but it doesn't have the same mouthfeel necessarily at the table as one would have with the other.
Yeah, like you can spend an entire campaign just wanting to get one major charge, for example.
Yeah, that's how a lot of campaigns end. It's just like, all right, we did it. So one of my favorite schools is Fulminaturgy, which is gun magic. It's about guns less as, a means of inflicting violence and more as a means of controlling society through the threat of violence. So they charge through essentially open carrying, but they would taboo. It gets a bit dicey, but like in one of the versions of Fulminaturgy, which is the one I prefer, taboos if you ever actually shoot someone. And
That's not a threat anymore.
Yes, exactly. The threat has been violated. The social contract has been violated. So, to give an example of a minor spell, and they all have fun names, there's Round in the Air, where you can make any animal in a certain radius around you just instantly flee by shooting a gun in the air. This doesn't include humans, but any other creature is just gone. And then there's Mao's Garden, as in political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, as in you can control riots by waving your gun around like a conductor's baton.
I also appreciate the nuance of it, just because it's not like guns are cool. It's like, no. This tool, this creation has a particular symbolic power, and I'm diving into that.
Exactly. Very much, a lot of adept magic is very much about sort of missing the forest for the trees, in a way, in a very symbology-driven way.
And also, if you want to make like super gun haver guy in Unknown Armies, like you don't need an adept or magic school for that. It's quite simple.
Yeah. Tormsen, what's one of your favorites?
I like, and I'm going to go back to second ed for this because it's not a third ed version of this, like official one, although there is kind of. I have a soft spot for videomancy, which is one of our first episodes was on that. Yeah,
very first.
It is a school of magic where you charge up by fetishizing a very specific television show. It worked the way it's written, and it is very much in the culture of broadcast TV versus streaming. Although there's people have come up with versions of the streaming shows based magic, like binge watching magic, but it's very much about, I have to watch my show. I have to watch my stories. If it's on, I have to watch it. If I don't, you lose your powers. So very much about fetishizing a show in that sense. And you're able to draw from the power of television. There's a 3E school called Cinemancy, which is similar, where it draws from the power of cinema, same concept. So bringing in, a lot of the magic is based on being able to simulate the tropes of television or cinema and bring that into reality, like turning whatever situation you're in into a situational comedy, which is great in a gunfight because it changes the stakes. That is one of the ones, and it's just fun. And I like the fact, even though it's videomancy as it was written back in the day, was very much second ed era, and it's harder now. But I like the fact that it's harder now. I like the fact that you actually have to watch television and the commercials. That just makes it better to me. But then again, I like my analog analog horror question mark, but you know what I mean.
And it feels a lot like trying to do like the streaming one about binge watching would be about like a very different symbolic resonance, like one about consumption rather than videomancy, which it seems to be like about adherence to like this
Yeah,
pattern.
yeah. I am loyal
Yeah.
to Days of Our Lives.
And one of the things that I saw when looking up this was that there seemed to be terms for practitioners, like someone into mediomancy may be known as a megaphone. And I like that as in world, just kind of a tongue in cheek thing that adepts
Yeah.
may be using to talk about one another.
There's an example used for urbanomancers, which are city-based adepts, and they have like every school will have like sort of a slang term,
A few usually,
just
yeah.
to a few different slang terms, which means you can mix and match them because that makes sense. It's realistic that people would just be like, instead of saying urbanomancers, they just call them the rats in like casual conversation. But they give an example of urbanomancy, like if you're going to be like academic about it, like even urbanomancy, which is the rarefied form, it's still bad. Like all the adept names are still just bad combinations of Greek and Latin, just
Yeah.
thrown haphazardly in
Yeah.
there. And the reason they give is because the accurate word for an urbanomancer, which would be polysurgist, it just doesn't sound as cool.
Yeah.
We do that in English all the time. No one says ipsomobile. No one says
Yeah.
autokineticon as much as I would like them to say that instead of automobile.
That would be
But
pretty cool.
yeah, yes, I must take my autokineticon.
Nobody's going to remember that.
Get in the con.
Shit. You so this is this interesting thing. I do like the idea of now this mage game where you're just kind of building up an entire game to find the critical item that provides the key resonance that allows you to enable this great working of 40 successes that allows you to change the underlying fabric of society in some way. But one thing that you said, Frank and Tormsen, that jumped out at me was this idea of narcissism of minor differences. Is this just a commentary on the nature of obsession, or is this like, it feels, putting my game design helmet on, it looks like it's a way to prevent too many of these potentially powerful characters from kind of working together?
We have to ask because we have no idea what narcissism of small differences is in Mage. Like, this is a completely foreign concept to us. That was sarcasm.
So, I think good game design has a bit of column A, a bit of column B, and it should be integrated well enough that you can't really tell what was the spur of it. Oh, this is a cool world building idea versus, oh, this would make running the game a lot easier. It should ideally do a bit both. But like, yeah, you're right. I mean, I could see easily a game where you're playing a bunch of adepts of the same kind, but yeah, there'd be a lot of bickering and the group probably wouldn't stay together for very long.
And it also seems to be this sense that you're all competing for the same resource.
Oh, yeah.
Like if you're a mediomancer and you're trying to get a mass work into the public, it's hard for everyone to do that.
Yes, different adept schools are more or less competitive. It varies based on the school. Like, go-to example is Cleomancy, which is history magic. And they get charges from basically having dominion over historical sites. And, only one person can have dominion over that historical site. Therefore, Cleomancers are often warring with each other in very overt and occulted manner. And this ties into Cleomancy being generally a very powerful school of magic, because basically what a lot of their stuff is based around spell-wise is pretty much mystical gaslighting, where you retroactively change history in a way to benefit yourself.
I would say when it comes to the small differences, they give an example of in I think second ed about the way adepts deal with each other. It's the way that like early Christian sects would just get into like massive fights over like the percentage of divine and human in Jesus, or like massive like fights over in modern leftist circles over like, is a guy that works at a coffee shop, is he bourgeois or is he proletarian? And just these just hair splitting fights that distract from, because they're so close to each other in worldview, adepts. They're so close that the differences just jump out, and you're like, you're 90% right, but this 10% is just intolerable. Whereas if you have two different adepts, it's just out of context probably. Be like I'm really into drinking and you're really into video games, so that's fine.
Yeah,
Like,
you're wrong, but in a way that
Yeah.
that's not really competitive with my sense of self.
I imagine it's very much like, oh yeah, he thinks that the world is run by videos, but like we all know that I'm right and that the world is actually run by farming.
Yeah, it's like,
You know,
being the guy that thinks the world that runs by video and running into a Christian. It's like, okay, I don't know if this guy's correct, but he's so off base that I'm not even gonna bother to try.
So, two narrative game questions. These sound fascinating. Where can the audience find out more of these adept schools? And in a game, most games are played in groups. Do they tend to have a mix of adept types? Do they tend to have a mix of adepts and archetypes? People pursuing avatar status? What does an Unknown Armies table game kind of look like? So the two questions: where can we find out more about this? And what does it look like at the game table?
So there's a few different editions of Unknown Armies. The first two came out in the 90s. And then there's the third one that came out going on a decade ago. The second edition is, kind of typical 90s trad game with some dice tricks and some kind of proto story gamey elements. Third edition leans a lot more into the story game stuff while still having a trad game foundation. And far as like learning about the world, I recommend reading the second edition core book, which you can get for real cheap on Drive-Thru RPG. And last I checked on Amazon, it doesn't go for that much if you want a print copy. And Tormsen's preference as far as actually playing the game is third edition. But if you want to just learn about the setting and the concepts, start with the second edition core book. It's literally designed to slowly initiate the reader into the setting, starting from the ground level, going upwards into the metaphysics.
Yeah, Unknown Armies, owned by Atlas Games, they do periodic bundle packs. I remember picking up Postmodern Magic for $2.99 during a particular sale and being thrilled that the person depicted on it was wearing the yellow sign. So if you're just looking, it's also interesting in that it has a large but unusually disparate player community in terms of resources. Like there hasn't been that one thing that really brings it all together into like a single Unknown Armies Discord or the fully fledged out version of the White Wolf Wiki, where if you kind of need mage information, it's probably there. So it seems like it's
very apropos.
Yeah, it seems like it's right below that critical mass to have kind of congealed into one place.
Well, there used to be the old John Tynes site, which is where people posted a lot of fan material. That went down, and then a couple of years ago was revived as unnaturalphenomena.com. So, and it's recently become active again, people posting things. This is fan stuff. This is fan ideas, fan schools, fan avatars, fan everything. There's a lot of material there. I'd recommend reading second ed and at least first, like getting an idea of it. But there has been a lot of stuff produced, and there's also, for something that's more specific or official, not official, but like canon, like not canon even, there is the onarmiesunknown.com website, which has a lot of reference material for rules and identities and things, cabal creation and other things that are quite useful.
Yeah, think of it like a fan SRD, something similar like the G20 SRD for like Pathfinder or whatever.
But there's not as much of a clear wiki per se, and it would be hard to do one for Unknown Armies because the canon is disputed deliberately in a way. Like, it's your Unknown Armies game it's not going to be someone else's. That's true for any game to an extent, but for a lot of things it is multi-choice. Big events are described as multi-choice. In third edition, there's something called the 030303 event, which caused a lot of metaphysical and physical disruption to the setting. And what caused it? How did it start? There's just multiple choices given. It could have been one of multiple things. Even in the first book, it was a lot of rumors in the sort of urban legends. Sense was a big part of the game, and you could just choose what you liked and mix it in.
The rumors sidebars were one of the first things that I really heard about Unknown Armies. Like when I was kind of first hearing about it, was the idea of how well they express these rumors, where they would like say something is happening and then give three mutually contradicting reasons for it. And that was very cool.
Yeah.
So far as communities, there is the Unknown Armies fan club Discord server, which is, it's definitely not as active as I'd imagine your average White Wolf RPG Discord is, but like it gets a fair amount of posting, and there's also a fairly active Unknown Armies Facebook group, from my understanding. I'm not on Facebook, so I don't know for sure, but Tormsen, you can corroborate on that or not. So the fans are there, and they have congregated.
It's one of the things where Unknown Armies has it's a relatively small, I guess, passionate like fan base, but it has like surprising staying power considering how small it is. It just keeps going. Like the fan material, like I'll be going back on it. This is great. This thing that someone wrote 25 years ago. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of games that are like as very like small base as Unknown Armies, it's done pretty well in terms of like staying around. People have heard of it.
Nothing feels quite like it.
No.
You've heard a lot of people you're saying before, Jordan, about like trying to get people to play, and that's a story as old as time.
Yeah.
Why don't you understand how good this is? You can play a magic guy powered by garbage. Like, why is this not an instant like? I don't get it.
So for what actually playing a campaign is like, and the sort of things that people play as, the average group usually has a pretty even split between adepts, avatars, and just otherwise normal people. Because sort of one of the running themes of the game, a very common thing you see is that magic tends to be run sort of counter to living a normal and especially like, I don't want to say decent, but like, I guess magic is often at odds with society and executive functioning. People that can perform magic, especially adepts, but to a lesser extent, avatars and other kinds of people with supernatural powers, tend to be at odds with society for various reasons. And the other supernatural powers thing I want to get into, because Unknown Armies is a game that tends to be very disparate, gonzo, and inclusive in the kinds of magic you can include. And I don't mean inclusive in, the quasi-political sense. I mean, like, there's people in the source books that are doing stuff like pyramid power. There's rules in the books for like having different kinds of psychic powers and stuff, being able to do premonitions, being able to actually
be
project.
A werewolf?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Like, and it has its own spin on werewolves involving demonic possession, and it's a whole can of worms. But basically, any kind of supernatural thing that you want to be in Unknown Armies, like, yeah, sure, go for it. Yeah, it may have its own unique spin on it. It might not, but
you won't be a very good
it all
werewolf.
works. It's not like World of Darkness where it kind of first has to fit all these things into very prescribed existing frameworks for this is what a demon is. This is what a werewolf is. This is what a vampire is. If you want to be something that's kind of vampire-esque, but very different from the sort of European-focused framework that World of Darkness tends to use, go for it. And the game just kind of doesn't care. The game's thesis is the world is really weird if you scratch underneath the surface a little bit. Just kind of let people do it.
It makes me think of like What We Do in the Shadows, where they got the energy vampire guy who just was like, I'm not sure on what my whole deal is either.
He's going from eggs and stuff, and it's like, all right, I guess.
But suddenly I see the school of hematomancy that is pulling power from the blood of others in some weird way that kind of rhymes with vampire, but isn't quite all the way there.
Very easily.
Often an Unknown Armies vampire will be literally a Vampire the Masquerade vampire, because they love that game so much that they become a real vampire. They have one power.
They vampire larped so hard that they became a vampire.
And that is the part to me that I like that seems to make it postmodern. It is Catholic lowercase c in that it does seem to include all, maybe not on the terms you expect, but there's space for everything there. In the same way that if you looked at World of Darkness and you're like, I'm a dragon, that would kind of, people would be like, really? A dragon? But there is a derpy way of doing that, seemingly, in Unknown Armies.
Yeah.
You're just an otherkin who occasionally turns into a real dragon, like
Yeah,
once
exactly.
a session.
Speaking of how interesting like the PCs are, but like, we know that we heard there, some very good notable NPCs in the game. Are there any notable characters from the game? And what's their deal? Like any particular ones?
Well, you got to talk about the freak. Like that's the
Oh yeah.
Let's talk about the freak.
the freak is a great single person encapsulation of Unknown Armies in my eyes.
Who or what is the freak?
That's legitimately a good question.
What information do we get regarding what the freak may be?
Okay, the freak is an individual, a human, that no longer exists canonically, or does it? We won't get into the debate over the pronouns of the freak.
Like this
That's
is
a whole
legitimate debate in setting too.
The freak is one of those rare avatar adept combos because which you can do. You can't be two adept types at the same time. You can't be two avatars at the same time. But you can be an adept and an avatar, which means that you're both playing a role that society accepts, the universe, the collective unconsciousness accepts, while also being a idiosyncratic lunatic about something specific. Now, the freak is what was known in second ed as a mystic hermaphrodite is now being rebranded as the sexual rebus, it is that archetype of which of the time it was I have huge theories on it that are too inside baseball, but it was something that it was an archetype which made sense within. It's not meant to be a trans person. It's meant to be an intersex person, or like someone who blurs the gender boundaries or any boundaries. Could be a mystic hermaphrodite. If there's any kind of dichotomy, any kind of
It's like a liminal
bipolarity,
figure.
the liminal figure,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's the mystic hermaphrodite, and the freak was an example of that. And also, while also being an epideromancer, which is someone who charges up from literal self-harm, like injuring yourself to get magic, which is one of the gnarlier second ed schools. Now, the freak was very, very powerful, and also it was one of those NPCs that is not provided stats in the books, which tells you the sort of role they take within the game. You're gonna have to take over, Frank. Tell me why you love the freak so much.
I mean, and we keep referring to the freak as it because when it showed up in the fiction at one point, it said, it identified itself with itself pronouns. This is not denigration. This is, we're using its preferred pronouns. And, this is in the 90s. So, honestly, kind of
Woke for
ahead
the
of the curve
90s.
on that
Woke for
regard.
the 90s.
Yeah, woke for the 90s.
And remember, the freak is very much the freak. It's not meant to
Yes.
represent any specific group or any particular. It's itself.
Yes.
It is very much itself, and it's very human in that regard. It's very much self-interested.
Yes.
It has its own shit going on.
The freak was gunning to ascend as the mystic hermaphrodite. Ended up not happening. It's complicated. But in pursuit of that, it acted ruthlessly and very self-destructively, as you might imagine, considering it's adept school, and was basically turned itself to sort of a boogeyman among what Unknown Armies calls the occult underground, which is sort of the subculture that all this disparate magic stuff exists within. And did that very intentionally as a means of accomplishing that role as a liminal figure, of being this sort of wild card within the occult underground. And then, there's also fun details like, all right, one, though, how it tended to get its significant charges is that it installed a chain link fence in its rib cage. And then just, you want to charge, you pull on the fence real hard and break your ribs.
So what made the freak so individually powerful?
It was the sort of resonance between its avatar, the role it was playing as an avatar, and the adept school it chose. Partially, in terms of mechanics. The funny thing, if you read the fiction, is like basically the thought processes of the characters are the exact same as players. Where they're like, all right, I want to get this many charges and do this, this, and this, and it's they're basically min-maxing, but the logic is all in setting.
I think
And the Mystical Hermaphrodite is one of the few avatars that also lets you get charges.
Okay.
But the other thing is just being this liminal figure, being this figure that society is generally very uncomfortable with, also tends to dovetail pretty well with the self-harm body horror school of magic.
some of it I feel that the freak was, and this is true of a lot of groups, individuals and groups within setting, is they do rely a bit on mystique and the rumors that are spread about them. They want to cultivate a reputation for power because having power is good, but having people know you have power sometimes saves you from using that power.
It also seems to be the case that, like Mage, adepts are probably pretty squishy. It's one of those things where at the end of the day, a gunomancer, which is to say someone with a long rifle and reasonably good aim, is probably, under the right circumstances, vastly more powerful than most magic characters that we get. Likewise, in a mage, there's very few magics that will stop you from being stabbed between the shoulder blades or being shot in the face. So it seems to be one of those things that adepts might be glass cannons. They have one or two cool tricks. They depend on kind of concealing it, and no one wants to have to find out.
We touched on this a little bit before, but I was going to bring it up. Unknown Armies is a game that allows for mundane characters pretty damn well, because they have the one thing is that adepts are pretty squishy. Anyone can be shot, anyone can be stabbed. And if you don't have any magic powers, you have the even greater magical power of being able to rent a car, because you have a credit score, which is hard to have if you're an adept.
And hold down a job and pay taxes.
Yeah.
And like that's your special power as a non-magical guy in Unknown Armies. It's, you're the guy that can go to the DMV for the party and actually fill out the paperwork legally.
Well, I was going to say the combat chapter is quite famous in RPG circles of like the Unknown Armies one. I think it's like, oh, here are all the things you could do instead of having a fight with someone, because fights in Unknown Armies can be very unpredictably lethal by design.
So it sounds like mortals have the advantage of the world is literally built for them. When you make mention of renting a car, and the same thing.
Much.
Yeah, you don't need Correspondence 3 in Mage if you have access to like medallion status on an airline or something like that. So we have the freak as one character. What's one other notable character that kind of pops up either in the lore or in the text of Unknown Armies?
All right, I dropped one on you, Tormsen. You dropped one on me.
Okay, I have a soft spot for old Alex Abel. Tell me who Alex Abel is, Frank.
Alex Abel is sort of Unknown Armies spin on the, playboy, billionaire, philanthropist faction leader. He ran a group called the New Inquisition. And their whole thing was that they basically operated like a powerful organized crime ring, taking out powerful wizards while also hoarding artifacts, magic items, and access to rituals and whatnot. Because this was all spurred by a moment called the Fall of the Keys, where Alex Abel believes that he got this close to ascending as an archetype. There was a moment where he dropped his car keys and just the statusphere in all its splendor was laid out clearly before him, and then he snapped back to reality and just back to the mundane world he was in. It was like, okay, I had some sort of mystical experience. I need to figure out what's going on about it with all this stuff. And his special power is having billions of dollars, because he was essentially seething over the fact he was just very resentful of the fact that, like, I did everything I was supposed to in life. And then there's this whole layer of reality that I'm giving this tantalizing glimpse of it, but then can't do it because I spent all my time, learning skills that are considered useful to most people instead of.
And he's not even sure of what it was. Like, he's not sure of what he almost ascended as or what he was found lacking in. It's that mystery that he was he almost got chosen, and he would never know why he wasn't ultimately chosen by the collective unconsciousness, which creates this sense, the seething resentment and like desire to understand.
Why
And
wasn't
so
I
even though,
picked? Why
it
not
must
why
me?
wasn't I picked?
particularly difficult for a billionaire who's probably, I mean, I know he's self-made, whatever, but like, imagine a billionaire being told no is particularly galling,
Yeah,
essentially.
we actually did an entire episode where it's just us speculating, like what archetype did he almost ascend as? But yeah, like he's a billionaire. He is like in saying the rare case of a self-made one because he is black and grew up in the United States from like the 60s onwards. Basically, was a college football player that then leveraged that into a lot of success in corporate finance during the 80s and then just built from
Mhm.
there on top of that. So
And him,
the guy that worked his way up from
Yeah,
poverty to
the
billions
odds.
being given this brief glimpse of something greater, he doesn't know where it is, and then told, no, you don't get to have that.
yeah, and so the fact that it is like part of the character, especially in both in the second ed version, third ed to an extent, is that he is that because he's a face of like the black billionaire, this face of black capitalism. He is himself, so he's not like any kind of stereotype or anything. But that context is really important
Yes,
to
yes.
his psychology, and that's what I really like about him. He's a psychologically complex character who's not a good guy, but not completely a bad guy either. It's not difficult to run. You can play as the New Inquisition, which is his group, and fine, it's not like an evil campaign necessarily, but it is a very specific tone, which is about, yeah, we got lots of money, we got lots of funding, at least in the 2e version. Want to learn more because the boss wants it. This is all. It's all about the boss and what he wants, and that's an interest. I like that as a structure.
And then he has a interesting character development into the third edition where that desire for control leads to sort of a Howard Hughes-esque arc where he just, after a couple prominent betrayals, circles the wagons extremely hard and starts actually, brainwashing people into making sure that they remain loyal to him.
And I guess that brings us to third. Who is the Comte de Saint Germain?
The first and last man. The key piece of continuity between all universes because he is the first and he's the last man. Exactly how he gets characterized is very much one of those multiple choice things in setting. He can be a diplomat, he can be a sort of wandering bard. The thing that comes to mind is like they give 3 options for him in one of the books, and like one of them is basically David Bowie, one of them's basically Tom Waits.
It is based on the legends of the Comte de Saint Germain being immortal, just drawing very much into that, but expanding it into like, yeah, he was here at the beginning, and when there is 332 archetypes up in the invisible clergy, he'll be the last to ascend. He's the capstone of the story of humanity, or at least he was until something changed.
Yeah. And then also in the next universe, he will be the literal first person to exist.
So he's able to survive the
one of the
somehow?
few. He's one of the few. There's
So there's
examples of kind of people stowing away from previous universes in weird metaphysical bunkers throughout the game's history, but it tends to be very much the exception rather than the rule. There's little to no continuity, universe, and he's the man who's been everywhere and seen everything and met everyone.
So is his role sort of to be like this all powerful, but like background NPC? Like he doesn't show up and like take over everything,
No.
but he kind of shows up for a second, does something, and leaves.
Yeah. He's there to watch, have a good time while he's here, see how things shake out, and then pieces out before anything gets too hot.
He has a prominent role in a couple of second ed scenarios where he is much like that. He's not really, well, he's sort of there as the mysterious figure around something which is going on, and he does that. That's a useful role. So sort of as this guy that keeps turning up in different contexts. completely different context. Like, oh, now he's a sheriff. Now he isn't. He doesn't remember that last time you met him. He hasn't shown up as much in third edition stuff in that role, but that's sort of the purpose he served.
Yeah, and we got an entire kind of little supplement seemingly featuring at least the name Bring Me the Head of the Comte de Saint Germain as a publication that I have sitting on my bookshelf above.
Yes.
I plan one to playtest for that. Yep.
I like the line 4 factions, 2 cabals, 1 600-pound head.
Yep.
And that's
a heist where the quarry is a giant stone head.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was going to be like the head is worth 600 pounds.
Nope. Nope. No. That is a weight, not as a weight,
Silly
not
me.
monetary value.
Greg Stolze has a way with words.
He sure does.
Frank Tormsen, thank you so much for giving a walkthrough of this fascinating and interesting game. One is, how can we listen to 33.3 FM? And the other one is, do you have a favorite supplement that you think people could mine for ideas? The biggest one for me has been book 4, I guess. What is that? Expose for the third edition. What other ones are good? And where can we find out about 33.3 FM?
So you can listen to 33.3 FM, and anyone at all can listen to 33.3 FM at SoundCloud/33.3 FM. There will be a link in the show notes, I'm sure. As for the supplement question, really, I find it hard to go wrong with this second edition core book. It just gives it's everything, a little bit of everything in one package, and just really helps guide you along that initiation rite and be like, I get this now. I basically get this now. If you want to get at me about like a non-core book, though, I'm really fond of one-shots, which is a collection of one-shot scenarios for the first edition, many of which are very iconic and many of which play very well.
I'm going to say, I'm also going to echo what Frank said about the second ed core book. As much as second ed core book and like book 1 to understand the third edition rules, and book 2 if you want to GM. But in terms of like splat books, I have a soft spot for Break Today, which was the source book specifically for Attax. It's not a perfect book by any means, but it's one I've come back to in terms of just like light reading. Me and a few others did a fan source book for Attax inspired by Break Today called Right, which is on Statusphere on DriveThruRPG, which I also suggest check out. But for the OG, it's Break Today. Attax is a whole different story that we won't get into, but it's one of my favorite groups.
Mm-hmm.
Frank and Tormsen, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for lending us your knowledge and expertise, and we look forward to seeing how the 33.3 FM project continues.
Thank you, and likewise for yours.
Thank you.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where there's always room in our invisible clergy for you. The show is made possible by our executive producers, and you can join their hollowed ranks at patreon.com/magethepodcast. I'll start with the oracles of the following avatar archetypes. Ben Bendelow, Oracle of the Captain, caller of shots, and leader of the crew. Buck Gregory, Oracle of the Explorer, always looking for something new. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Firebrand, champion of causes and movements. Guy Stewart, Oracle of the Guide, who shows other the path. Mikhail, Oracle of the Fool, who is feckless, random, but lucky. Pugaji, Oracle of the Hacker, the improvisational inventor. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of the Messenger, the unstoppable bearer of truth. The crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Mother, giver of comfort, aid, and protection. Jason Vines, Oracle of the Naked Goddess, who is perfect and aloof. Derek Simsick, Oracle of the Opportunist, who has a project and ambition. And Drawn Cap, Oracle of the Solid Citizen, who is an everyday hero. Along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Berto, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Archmaster Simon Strand, Archmaster Wolf Lyerson, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Andrews S., Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sig, Cromwell the Archaeologist, Curtis Hendricks, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David McFall, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Ian Robertson, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fregarock, George Laura, Gray Trelligage, Henry Kraft, Ia Bold, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Lawson Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canos, Matthew Proyle, Maurice Hopkins, Melissa Krause, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klemenov, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Seven S's, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, That's Real Neato, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, William Connolly, William Martin, and Will Vincent. Our EP shout-out this week is to Ian Robertson, who spells their name E-A-N, which reminded me of the emergency action notification. Now called a national emergency message, these are a type of U.S. message that begins with, we interrupt our programming with, this is a national emergency. There are 4 classes: presidential messages, local messages, state messages, and National Information Center messages. There have been a number of incidents where one of these was accidentally transmitted over the system. One of the earliest was on February 20th, 1971, when a NORAD teletype operator entered the wrong tape, which triggered the alert and caused U.S. stations to cease broadcasting programming immediately, but with no follow-up message as to what the emergency actually was. Broadcast could only resume once the proper code word had been transmitted, and only after 6 incorrect or improperly formatted cancellation messages over 40 minutes was the mistake cleared up. When I think of emergency notification systems in the U.S., I'll think of you, Ian. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magesofthepodcast@gmail.com or talk to us at magesofthepodcast.bisky.social on Blue Sky. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magesofthepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magesofthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
God, this reminds me of that furry episode you did where you just ended up talking about Delta Green the whole time, which is the most Unknown Armies thing I can imagine.
That sure was an episode.
We lost control. We lost control of this.
There are certainly episodes
sometimes.
you've done where I can tell that the spirit has moved you.
Well, no, this one was the guest.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.